Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Steve Barnes. In this episode, we'll be looking at the ways in which government officials, economists, and scientists can get a more exact reading of the true costs and benefits of federal regulation. And we're fortunate to be speaking today on this topic with Adam Finkel. Adam is a senior fellow here at Penn Law and is also the executive director of the Penn Program on Regulation. Adam's also a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Adam, thanks for joining us. So let's start off with a very basic question. Why is federal regulation so controversial?
These are big ticket items. They affect the whole country. I do domestic regulation mostly. And the stakes are very high. They can be hugely expensive. Mr. Trump said figure of $2 trillion per year for federal regulations. That's a preposterous exaggeration, but it's a high number. It's in the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And the regulations in total, we're talking about environmental safety, worker health and safety, consumer products, transportation, public health, all of those non-economic regulations. The estimates of the benefits are even higher in the many hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Mm-hmm. And they're controversial because they affect freedom in a profound way. The pendulum swings back and forth over the decades. Lately, we've been talking, I think, more about regulations getting in the way of freedom. That's part of the campaign this year is about getting the burden of regulations, the job-killing regulations off of countries' back. But people lately tend to forget there are freedoms to do what you want to do, and there are freedoms from harm. There's the freedom to go through your life, to go to work in the morning and come home safe and sound at night. So it's a balancing of those kinds of constraints. I think on our homepage of the Penn Program on Regulation, maybe it pops out on occasion on the rotation, but there's a quote, no one knows where this quote comes from, but it says, "The wise restraints that make us free." So they're almost like laws. We're here at a law school, but they are complicated codes that are delegated from Congress to these administrative agencies. So they act like they're like speed limits, but they're vastly more complicated than that. And people don't like to be told what to do. Sure.
So on the one hand, absolutely, we're in an election season. It's, as always, it seems it's a highly partisan charged environment, and the stakes are obviously, as you point out, quite high. So on the one hand, there are things like financial regulations, legislation like Dodd-Frank, and then there are other forms of regulation like for airbags and so forth. So just stepping back a bit, so where do regulations come from? What are the originations of this? Is this an agency thing? Is it an executive branch thing? How does it work in that sense?
It's an executive branch function that's delegated from Congress. So Congress writes the laws. The Clean Air Act was written in 1970, amended in 1990. The Clean Air Act says that the Environmental Protection Agency has to look around and look for instances where people are being harmed, and they need to balance the costs of controlling that harm against the benefits of it. So again, it comes from, no agency issues a regulation without it being legal under the statute that they're working under, but Congress doesn't have the expertise or the time, and these are very participatory processes. People involved in them get to come to public hearings, write comments. It's not the place for Congress to be involved in these kind of details. So they write the broad statutes, and then the agencies look around and say, this year we need to put on our priority list this hazard or this process, and that starts what's usually a multi-year process of getting from the design stage to the implementation stage.
Right, so whether you're the EPA working on, as you point out, clean water, clean air, what have you, or, for example, transportation, regulating the nation's highways and so forth, that is, in a sense, sort of an extension of the executive branch, the White House, correct, with a mandate legislation from Congress. So with all that in mind, so how do government officials, scientists, economists, and others, agency people, determine whether regulations are sensible, warranted or not?
So the impulse for somebody, and I was a regulator at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for 10 years before I came here. We are looking for places where we think unnecessary harms are being created, where the benefits of reducing that harm are smaller than the costs of containing the harm. So we're really, in a sense, looking to extract welfare or better the lives of the citizens out of a situation, a free situation that is imperfect. Over the years, it's come to be more formalized, and whereas 30 or 40 years ago, the impulse was very sort of qualitative and let's solve this problem as best we can at a cost that seems sort of impressionistically reasonable. Now this discipline of cost-benefit analysis has become dominant. It's hard for an agency now to put out a regulation without what often runs into thousands of pages of very detailed and very quantitative analysis, and the common currency of these analyses are money. So the people who work on the benefits side tend to be initially scientists who are trying to figure out what the benefits measured in longevity, fewer premature deaths, better quality of life, less disease, environmental benefits, more visibility, more species protection. They're trying to figure out how the rules could improve all of those things. Numerically, how many lives would be saved, how many cases of some disease would be averted. They turn it over to economists who use other, other methods to what they call valuate or value those benefits in monetary terms.
So in other words, put a price tag on it.
Put a price tag on it. They do that not in order to avoid the hard choices. They do it in a way to make the hard choices not necessarily easier, but at least something where it's more transparent and people can say, okay, we're controlling it up to this level and no further because we've decided that the costs of controlling further actually begin to outweigh the benefits. So it's a process of saying we could save this many lives, we value those lives. Right now the federal agencies, roughly speaking, say saving a life or averting a premature death is worth on the order of $8 million per person. And then we say at some point extracting more and more benefits begins to be so costly that the harms to the economy outweigh those benefits. And that's a rough stopping point for saying the regulation should be this strict and no more.
Okay, so how do you actually get at what those benefits are?
That's where the scientists come in, and they try to look at all of the different harms that are created by the economic activity or the pollution or the products we use that are inherently not completely safe. And they ask questions about, obviously, mortality is a big issue. What are the deaths that are being caused by this process or product? Whether
it's airbags or pollution or
right,
what have you?
Right. But there are other categories of benefit. There are things which aren't likely to kill you, but are likely to impede your quality of life, cause disease, cause injury. Obviously, financial regulation. There are benefits of increased information, consumers being able to make wiser choices. All of that, as best they can, and some of these categories are much harder to quantify than others, particularly some of the environmental. How do you even measure what the effect of reduced air pollution would be on biodiversity or the number of species that we preserve? Those are hard scientific questions, but we've reached a point where we think we're good enough at the scientific part to categorize the benefits and put rough estimates with error bounds on the magnitude of them.
Okay. So, as an aside, for example, in preparing for this episode, I noticed on the White House's website, President Obama, with his Clean Power Plan, says that this plan will save thousands of lives, prevent premature deaths, and obviously there is a benefit to that. For someone, especially in this election season, who may be more of a libertarian, more free market orientation in terms of the political ideology, how do you square that circle, so to speak? How do you show that the benefits are worth it in terms of impinging on someone's, economic opportunity or civil liberties?
So again, I would come at that from the outset from the balancing perspective. Libertarians believe in the freedom to pursue happiness through the market. They, in my view, need to be reminded that part of what freedom and pursuit of happiness involves is safety and health and a clean environment and be able to walk the streets without worrying about gun violence. All of those things have both aspects to them. So the Clean Power Plan is a good example where all of those figures about premature mortality come from scientific studies of the effects of fine particles of mercury, of other things that come from particularly coal-fired power plants on the human organism. So a libertarian would say, I suppose, as long as we inform people of what those risks are, if they're particularly averse to them, they can emigrate or move elsewhere or go places where there isn't so much pollution. But I think even dyed-in-the-wool economists would say those costs in terms of health harms, they're real, and the market is not properly pricing those goods. They call them externalities. They say that we're able to make electricity more cheaply because we're not paying for the harms that we foist on other people by making them as cheaply as we can. So the right, in quotes, price would be the price that includes either compensating people for their disease, which is hard to do, and small comfort to the next of kin when it's mortality. So regulators think the right, in quotes, price would involve putting some controls on the process, make it a little bit more expensive, but reduce by a greater extent those harms to the other people who are not, after all, choosing with full information or the full ability to pick up and move somewhere, that this inexpensive product is really not good for them and therefore not good for society.
Great. So we've talked about figuring out sensible ways to get at the benefits. Now, what about the costs? You mentioned coal-fired plants. Again, in election season, there's a lot of talk about energy and national security, and of course, jobs and viable businesses, economic opportunity. How do you get at measuring the costs?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to just step back a little bit and say, so for probably the first half of my career, maybe I'm more than halfway through at this point, but I'm a public health scientist. I worked at a think tank, I worked in government, and I worked mostly on the science side, on the benefits side of regulation. There's been a pretty widespread sort of conventional wisdom about the benefits, that is the risk reduced. Somewhat ironically, that conventional wisdom, which I think is more of an urban legend, has been pretty much created and publicized by economists and to some extent political scientists. But the conventional wisdom is that the risks are exaggerated. You've probably heard the old line about we test these chemicals on animals. You'd have to drink 50,000 diet sodas a day to have the dose in the laboratory. There's some truth to those sorts of things, but the general message is if the government tells you that so many thousands of lives will be saved, they're giving the worst case scenario. So a lot of my work for my first couple of decades in my research and scholarly career was looking carefully at that, and my considered view is that is an urban legend, that most of the risks have not been exaggerated. In fact, some of them have been underestimated. So meanwhile, for that whole time, I think the people doing the costs of regulation and the people taking those assertions and spinning them out into the political sphere, they've kind of gotten a free pass. We've not looked hard at whether the costs are properly estimated. I turned my focus about 5 or 8 years ago from more intense focus on the science to looking at the economics. I worked in an economic think tank for my first job out of grad school at Resources for the Future, and worked among economists and have a pretty good training in what they do. And I'm not by any means the first person to say this. The very clear track record of the costs of regulation as estimated at the time as compared to what we've learned about how expensive regulations actually are, that in fact is where the repeated, almost invariant exaggeration comes in. The costs are almost always overestimated at the outset. And there are some obvious reasons for that. Before something is made in mass quantities, when there's only one of them, when there's one catalytic converter on a prototype laboratory somewhere, and EPA, or in this case the Department of Transportation, is thinking about should we require these pollution control devices on cars, they're going to have to estimate the cost of that based on pretty much how much it costs to build the first one. And when you're building 1 million a year, the cost goes way down. The other obvious reason is agencies have some incentive to not underestimate costs. They don't want to be back in court saying that they erred on the low side. And of course, the businesses who would have to pay these costs have every incentive to hedge on the side of this is going to be much worse for us if you make us do it than it really will be when they have to. So this goes back many decades. One of the classic examples of what seemed like a surprise but was not at all a surprise to anybody in the field was probably in the late 1970s. OSHA, where I used to work, put out a regulation on a chemical called vinyl chloride that was carcinogenic, and the business interests stalled it for several years with stories of how expensive it was going to be to control this chemical in their plants. And within, I think, several weeks after the rule was finally promulgated, went through court review and survived court review, there were headlines in the chemical magazines. The polyvinyl chloride industry, I think the headline was, leaps out of jeopardy into jubilation. They were not only not spending very much money, they were actually saving money by keeping more of their expensive product in the system rather than in the lungs of their workers. And I think they knew that beforehand. So it really wasn't a surprise that this rule was much less expensive and arguably even was an economic benefit as well as a public health benefit.
So let's talk about some of your more recent research. So your background is in public health and risk assessment. You've talked about the economic approach to this. So what are the comparative values or benefits to using one approach versus another? Or are they complementary somehow?
Yeah, they're definitely complementary. We really can't do a cost-benefit comparison without doing both. Part of the problem has been all along, there's not been a lot of teamwork involved. The scientists go off in one corner of the building and estimate the risk reduced, which become the benefits. The economists are somewhere else. Usually later in the process, the scientists say, we're thinking about this much control, so how much would that cost? They go off and do their work, and it's only assembled towards the end. One big problem has been they are complementary, but it doesn't make much sense to spend a lot more time on one half of the ledger than the other. It doesn't make a lot of sense to create a very intricate risk estimate, and then at the very end of the process sort of marry it to a very rough and ready impressionistic cost estimate. You're wasting, if the best you can do is 11th hour cost estimate, you may as well not spend all that time polishing the chrome on the risk estimate. It just delays the process. So as I said, I think the interesting thing is that for many years the economists have been doing their half of the job, but also sort of poaching into the scientific area and making, in many cases, very helpful, thoughtful suggestions about how the risk assessors could do their job better. As a risk assessor, I thought to myself some years ago, maybe it's time for somebody to say, there are some problems on the economic side as well. It shouldn't be a tightly controlled fiefdom fraternity where you can't, from the outside, suggest ways to improve. One obvious difference has been, and this is a paper I had in the Michigan Journal of Administrative Environmental Law a couple of years ago, that as the years have gone by, the scientists have gotten better and better and more careful about expressing uncertainty. I'm saying, my colleagues decided a long time ago that it really wasn't helpful and honest to put out these estimates with 4 digits of precision and never tell the public that that's maybe the best estimate we can come up with, the average of all of these possibilities, but there is room for error. So now we very routinely say not 1,217 lives will be saved. We say that's a pretty good idea of what we think will happen on average, but it could be much less. It could be as low as, say, 500 lives. It could be much more. It could be as high as 1,750 lives. So we don't give the false sense of confidence that we really know more than we're saying. All along, the cost estimates have been expressed to the nearest dollar, sometimes to the nearest penny, without any admission that these estimates are, in fact, in some cases, more uncertain than even the science estimates would be. So I've been trying to sort of gently prod the people doing cost estimation to at least easy and sort of a no-brainer. The first thing you could do is just be a little more transparent about, we really don't know to the nearest dollar at all what these things will cost. And I've, of course, been trying to get them to be a little more thoughtful about the built-in exaggerations and try to build that into the estimate to say, we know how to come up with 1 million catalytic converters at the price of the first prototype, but we really should be giving people, even at the outset, 1 million of them at the cost that it will eventually be when the costs go down.
Not to interrupt, but how could we be more uncertain about the costs versus the risks?
So clearly, some of these risks are very uncertain. When we test on lab animals, we really don't know exactly how to extrapolate down to lower dose. There are all kinds of scientific problems that are being worked on, but some of them are intractable in the sense that we do our best and we sometimes are surprised. But usually, the track record of risk assessment is actually pretty good. I say to my students, almost any time that somebody makes the mistake, I think, of saying something like, no one ever thought this could happen. It certainly happened with Katrina. There were some statements by the president then. No one thought the levees would be overtopped by the floods. And if you go back, you'll almost always find a risk assessor somewhere, probably in obscurity, but publishing something saying, if this happens, that will happen. And we have a pretty decent record of anticipating, not always of stopping them before they happen, but at least saying. Another great example of that, by the way, I've just been thinking about, it's an anniversary of the first space shuttle accident, the Challenger in 1986. There were all kinds of risk assessment reports buried in the drawers of NASA saying that exactly what happened in January of 86 would happen with a pretty high probability. They knew it, but they were hoping that it wouldn't happen.
Right, and just to, again, sorry to interrupt again, but risk assessment almost sounds like an industry term, like jargon. All it is taking the context of a situation, whether you're looking at a space shuttle or the safety and viability of the levees in New Orleans, looking at the context and assessing, figuring out what the risks are and how to reduce them, correct? That's what we mean when we talk about risk assessment.
So there's lots of uncertainties there. But on the economic side, it's not just that we don't know what an individual widget will cost in several years and we have to make more of them. There's a pretty fundamental philosophical problem with cost economics for regulation, that the people who do it and the theory behind it usually looks only at the costs as they're borne by the industries that are burdened by the regulation. And they tend not to look at the economic benefits to the sectors of industry whose profitability and whose demand and whose employability and jobs will go up as a result of government intervening in the free market and saying, we need to make more scrubbers to clean the air from power plants. Well, that's not good for the coal-fired power plant people, but if their prices go up, it may increase demand for natural gas, it may spur innovation in the natural gas sector, but meanwhile, there are going to be people hired, until we have full employment, those people will be hired off the unemployment rolls to produce the scrubbers that the free market decided not to buy, but the government said, if you want clean air, we're going to have to create a scrubber industry and produce those. So the whole panoply of changes in the economy are much more than raise your hand if you feel bad about this regulation and tell me how much it will cost you. There are people who know they will benefit economically, but they're not really enfranchised to come into the rule and say, I would actually love to be able to hire more people and build more scrubbers, but people won't buy them until the government says we need cleaner air. Mm-hmm. So that's why the costs can be so uncertain, because we're really not only built-in exaggeration, but we're really not asking the right question. We're not asking what will the economy look like under this new regulatory regime. We're asking how will the one affected industry look, and they're always going to have a negative in front of them. But the whole change may not be as negative as the partial change looks like.
So in that context, how do you reconcile the civil libertarian free marketeers' notion of being able to pursue economic opportunity without the intervention of the federal government, while, say, if I live near a coal-fired plant, I do not want the negative effects of the pollution, any sort of other hazards that may be in the ground or wherever else. In other words, reconciling the liberty of economic opportunity with not having my or my family or my community's liberty impinged upon through the proliferation of pollution and so forth. How do you...
And that's what, not to give a simple answer, but that's what we call politics. And at different times in our history, the pendulum has been a little tipped towards one side or the other. My view as a former regulator is I believe in cost-benefit analysis. I think that we're getting better and better at it, at making a pretty good estimate of what the change in welfare will be, and that most of these regulations, especially when they have to pass these rigorous analytic tests and survive congressional scrutiny and court review, they end up producing more benefit than harm. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody will be in favor of it, but it means that the people whose economic activity is being circumscribed for the sake of public health or safety or clean environment, to some degree, they may not agree, but they, I believe, should accept at least the principle that what they're being asked to give up is in the service of additional, more than their losses will be outweighed by others' gains. Now, it doesn't mean that, again, that they should be happy about it. So it doesn't mean they should be happy about it, but again, there have been times in our history where, more often than not, the people who are not being protected were being told that your health or your safety is outweighed by the economic activity that's going on. I think the better way to do it is to run the numbers objectively with regard for error and say, if we can create more benefit than harm, we should do that. Now, maybe the final answer is to not stop at the first intervention, but to say, I believe, last I heard, that candidate Clinton is saying sort of the same sorts of things. If we decide that we do need to put much tighter controls on the coal industry for the climate change issues, the atmospheric pollution, the respiratory disease, the harm to coal miners, et cetera, and we know that by doing that we're going to create jobs in natural gas, but also in renewables, but let's not forget about the coal miners, the workers, and the executives in that industry. Maybe there's a way to take all of those benefits that we've sort of created by intervening in the economy and plow some of them back into those communities, into those industries for retraining, for other kinds of compensation. Again, the theory is if we can create benefits not out of nothing, but out of the wise hand of society intervening, if they're extra benefits, we can then push them back into compensating the people who've been hurt. And ultimately, economists talk about a situation where everybody benefits, because if you create more than you had, you can make whole the people who lost, while the people who gain are still doing better.
Right. So, politics. Again, it's an election season, and you've got people arguing about the wisdom of society intervening or government intervening, and then you've got folks on the other side saying that the invisible hand of the free market is much wiser. So So getting back to your research, though, you got an article, a new article about the perceived costs of regulation, and there are some pretty interesting, if not counterintuitive, findings from that. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So I was talking a little while ago about sort of emphasis relative to economics on risk, and one of the ways that there's been, one of the fields that has concentrated only on the risk side for now going on 40 years has been the sort of psychology of risk and the field of risk perception. So there have been many studies, including some pretty large-scale survey research, asking people about their attitudes towards risk, their choices. Obviously, the very famous work by the Nobel laureate at Princeton, Dan Kahneman, and his book on Thinking Fast or Slow. All of that scholarship has been about how lay people, first of all, how literate, in a sense, they are, how numerate they are, whether they're able to properly understand the magnitude of risk, if they can at least answer the questions properly. You know, would you, which of these two risks is larger if you express it in different ways, and then all about their risky choice, how people think about balancing risks to themselves. So that's been going on for all these years. Lots of interesting findings about what some people call irrationality, what other people call how humans are. They have views and biases and perceptions about things which are not rational or irrational. They just are what they are. But nobody's really thought much at all about how literate or cognizant people are of what regulatory costs really are, and then how they process information about being offered different hypothetical choices among regulations of different cost. So with support from the National Science Foundation and my collaborators in Eugene, Oregon at a firm, Decision Research Institute, we did a large-scale survey of about 1,000 people over the last couple of years, asking them a very involved set of questions. We gave them a fairly sizable compensation and some gift cards and lotteries and so forth to induce them to wade through this whole, probably a 45-minute online survey, asking lots of questions about how much do you know about the cost of regulation, what do you think about how the government does its work, do you have beliefs about whether the government in fact does exaggerate, understate, or is more or less accurate on cost. And then we asked a lot of very hard questions with a graphical interface that allowed people to make their own complicated cost-benefit choices about how people would really prefer to trade off large-scale, life-saving programs for very large sums of everyone's money. So we had a interface where people could slide the lives up and down a scale, and they would see what the effects were at the per person and per national level, and slide the costs around, and end up with a zone of where they thought a regulation would be reasonable. So it's preliminary. Our first set of results was published in the journal Risk Analysis just last month. We hope it's the beginning of a field of inquiry about paralleling all this work for decades on risk communication and risk perception with cost communication and cost perception. Right. Basic findings of the work, again, it's a very long survey, but on the how numerate are people, we mixed bag, but we found that people, to some extent, tended to overestimate the cost of regulation. We gave them a real case having to do with how much it would cost to make passenger cars stronger so that when they rolled over they would not crush the occupants. There's a real regulation on the books that required cars to be strengthened, the roof struts to be strengthened, and there's a real number for how much that actually added to the price of the car. Overwhelmingly, people thought it was much harder to do that than it really was. They overestimated the cost of that. Maybe that means that when people see estimates of costs that are large and exaggerated, they don't see them as exaggerated because it makes sense to them that these things will be very expensive. If in fact, as I believe is the case, the agencies are taking some sort of self-interested estimates from business and passing them on as the truth, then people won't object to that because it sort of seems right to them that these things will be highly expensive. In terms of how people looked at choices among regulations, we tried very hard to make people think hard about uncertainty. If we told them that the government has a really precise handle on how much things cost, exactly how many lives were saved, exactly how much it would cost, we asked them to sort of think about what the right balance between life saving and cost would be. Then we changed the rules on them and said, suppose, as we think really is the case, these cost estimates, despite the fact that they're presented as if we really know, that they're really wildly uncertain. So how would you think about the regulation you just said was a pretty good deal if we told you that it's not $1 billion, but it's between $500 million and $2 billion, or $250 million and $4 billion? We kept the average the same, but we said, if we really know less and less, do you feel differently about the choice you just said was reasonable? There's a lot of work on the risk side that people are averse and cautious about uncertainty. The more uncertain things are, the more they'd rather just take a sure thing and not sort of gamble with things maybe being worse, even though they might be better. That's called loss aversion. No one had ever asked about this similar phenomenon on the cost side, and again, we had a mixed bag of results, but I think actually the key finding was that even though some people seemed to be skittish about uncertainty and cost and were sort of throwing up their hands and saying, I liked this a minute ago, but now that you told me we really don't know what it costs, I'm more nervous about it. Other people were very accepting of it, and to some extent were even more willing to let government impose these costs, because when they learned that it might be cheaper than we thought, they sort of said, well, that's the best outcome of all. We save lives at less expense, so I'm willing to take that chance that it might be worse on the economy for the chance it might be better. Put those together, and I think the key finding is people are really affected by uncertainty. And so the message to economists is, if you're going to suppress that information from them and tell them that we know to the nearest dollar what things cost, pretty much everybody had a different view one way or the other when they were told, actually, these numbers are very fragile and fuzzy. So it's, again, more exhortation to the economists to stop giving these artificially precise estimates.
Right. So one more time, election season, and these are part of the perennial political debates in Washington and elsewhere. A lot of talk about regulations in the mainstream press and social media, the blogs, how either regulations are critical to saving people, the environment, and so forth, or they're suffocating job killers. How do you communicate the facts, the information, for example, in your research, to the wider public? How do you inform public debate about regulation, which is a hot topic, but it seems to be, in terms of what's out there in the realm of public opinion and public dialogue, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what the facts are. How do you get that information out there?
I think it's just a matter of what scholars do is to try and sort of tamp down the extreme, unrealistic, self-serving, hysterical views on both sides of the spectrum. I have to say, lately I've heard, I certainly sort of came of age at a time when there were lots of very fraught concerns about public health and the environment. So I'm not old enough for Silent Spring, but the 1970s with the rivers catching on fire, there were bad things happening, and there was some extent of exaggeration of how bad those things were. We still see some of that. I believe the anti-vaccine movement is an example of that. The anti-GMO movement, genetically modified foods, is to some extent. But lately, these days, I think there's been much more shrill tone coming from the anti-regulatory side. The $2 trillion figure that Donald Trump came up with yesterday, I think it's a discredited $1.5 trillion figure that he rounded up to 2, but the figure is almost meaningless. It's pulled out of cross-national studies that have no relevance. The job-killing refrain. My colleague Carrie Colonese and Chris Carrigan and I had a book come out a year and a half ago from the Penn Press called Does Regulation Kill Jobs? And our short answer was no. It definitely will leave some job loss in its wake, but on balance, it also creates modest numbers of jobs in general, and the net effect is almost invariably noise in a very noisy economy. It's not the regulations that are doing it. The coal industry is having its issues for several reasons, with regulation being pretty far down on that list. So again, I come back to that's what politics is. If the people who are construing freedom as make whatever I want whenever I want to are in the ascendancy, that's how politics works. But my view has always been that's a legitimate view, but also the legitimate view of I would like to live a full lifespan. I worked in OSHA and worker protection. I like to come home at night. The number of workers who don't come home at night is still holding pretty steady at about 5,000 a year killed in accidents, and about probably tens of thousands per year killed prematurely by chemicals in the workplace. We could reduce that toll at very modest cost, and we have chosen not to do that.
This is a good point, I think, to conclude this episode. It's a fascinating discussion, and certainly look forward to seeing more of your work as it proceeds ahead. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us next time on Case in Point.